In the modern world, silence has become rare. From the moment many people wake up, the mind is surrounded by stimulation. Notifications appear on a screen. Voices emerge from podcasts or videos. Messages arrive from colleagues, friends, or strangers. Even moments that once belonged to quiet reflection, waiting in line, walking through a park, sitting on a train, are now filled with digital noise. It is not unusual to see someone reach for their phone within seconds of experiencing silence. What is unusual, however, is the ability to sit calmly with one's own thoughts. For most of human history, solitude was not a rare experience. People walked long distances alone. They worked quietly in fields, workshops, or forests. There were long evenings with no glowing screens, no constant updates, fun, and no endless streams of information competing for attention. In those quiet hours, the mind naturally turned inward. People thought about their choices. They reflected on their actions. They observed their own emotions and considered the direction of their lives. Today, something subtle but important has changed. Many people have lost the ability to be alone without feeling uncomfortable. If the room becomes quiet, the instinct is to turn on music. If there is a pause in conversation, the phone appears. If someone walks alone for 10 minutes, they often fill the space with audio or scrolling. This behavior is not necessarily intentional. It's simply a habit formed by an environment that constantly competes for attention. But beneath this habit lies an important psychological reality. When external noise disappears, the mind begins to speak. Thoughts appear that have been ignored during the day. Questions about work, relationships, goals, or identity begin to surface. Emotions that were pushed aside during busy hours return to awareness. For many people, this experience can feel uncomfortable. The mind prefers distraction because distraction delays a confrontation with unresolved thoughts. Yet throughout history, some of the most disciplined thinkers understood the value of this quiet confrontation. The Roman emperor and philosopher Marcus Aurelius once wrote extensively about the importance of retreating into one's own mind, not to escape the world, but to observe it more clearly. Despite holding one of the most powerful positions in the ancient world, he frequently reminded himself that clarity of thought required moments away from public noise and social expectations. Another Roman thinker, Seneca, warned that a person who is constantly surrounded by crowds may slowly lose the ability to hear their own reasoning. His concern was not social interaction itself. Human beings are naturally social creatures. Cooperation and community have always been essential for survival. The problem arises when a person becomes psychologically dependent on constant external input. When this happens, the mind gradually loses an important skill, independent reflection. Without quiet moments, thoughts are rarely examined. Decisions are often shaped by trends, group opinions, or immediate emotions rather than careful reasoning. Modern psychology supports this observation, and the human brain is highly responsive to stimulation. Every notification, message, or new piece of information activates systems related to attention and reward. Over time, this creates a pattern in which the brain begins to expect frequent stimulation. Silence, in contrast, provides no immediate reward. At first, it may even feel uncomfortable, but silence performs an important function for the mind. It creates space. In that space, the mind begins to organize experiences. It reviews conversations. It processes emotions. It searches for patterns and meaning in daily events. This process is not dramatic. It does not produce instant excitement, but it quietly strengthens a person's ability to understand themselves and the world around them. Without these moments of internal organization, thoughts remain scattered. Imagine a desk where papers are constantly being added but never arranged. Eventually, important information becomes difficult to find. The surface becomes cluttered. The same thing happens inside the mind when stimulation never stops. Solitude acts as the moment when the desk is finally cleared and arranged. Ideas become more structured. Problems become easier to examine. Emotions become easier to understand. Over time, a person who regularly spends time alone develops a different relationship with their own thoughts. Instead of avoiding silence, they begin to value it. Instead of fearing reflection, they use it as a tool. This transformation does not happen immediately. In fact, the first encounters with quiet reflection can feel unfamiliar. The mind may wander, it may replay past events or imagine future scenarios, and some thoughts may feel uncomfortable to examine. But these moments are not signs of weakness. They are signs that the mind is beginning to do something important. It is beginning to observe itself. This ability to observe one's own thoughts without immediately escaping into distraction is one of the foundations of mental discipline. It allows a person to recognize patterns in their behavior. It creates the opportunity to question assumptions. It strengthens the capacity to make decisions based on careful reasoning rather than impulse. In many ways, the simple act of walking alone without distraction can become a form of mental training. Each step creates a rhythm. Each quiet moment creates space for reflection. Gradually, the mind settles into a slower, more deliberate pace of thinking. And in that slower rhythm, something interesting begins to happen. The noise of the world fades slightly, and a different voice becomes easier to hear. It is the quiet voice of one's own reasoning. Understanding why this voice is often ignored and why many people instinctively avoid silence is the next step in understanding the art of walking alone. Because before someone can benefit from solitude, they must first understand an important question. Why does the mind resist silence in the first place? That question leads us to the deeper psychological challenge explored in the next chapter. Why the mind fears silence. There is a curious pattern in modern human behavior. A person can spend hours surrounded by noise, conversation, and digital activity without feeling overwhelmed. But place that same person alone in a quiet room for 20 minutes, and something unusual often happens. The silence begins to feel uncomfortable. The instinct is immediate. The hand reaches for a phone. Music is turned on. A video begins to play. The quiet space is quickly filled. This reaction is so common that many people rarely question it. But the reaction reveals something important about the human mind. Silence removes distraction, and when distraction disappears, the mind begins to turn inward. At first glance, this may seem harmless. After all, people think constantly throughout the day. They plan tasks, respond to messages, and make decisions. Thinking is not unfamiliar. Yet there is a difference between surface thinking and reflective thinking. Surface thinking is reactive. It focuses on immediate tasks and external information. Reflective thinking, on the other hand, begins to examine deeper questions. Questions about identity, direction, and personal behavior. Silence invites this second form of thinking. And this is precisely why the mind sometimes resists it. When external noise disappears, the mind can no longer hide from unresolved questions. Why am I dissatisfied with my work? Why did that conversation bother me so much? Am I moving in the direction I truly want? These questions rarely appear when attention is constantly occupied. But when a person walks alone without stimulation, the brain naturally begins to process unresolved experiences. From a psychological perspective, this process is deeply connected to how the brain manages information. Throughout the day, the mind absorbs an enormous amount of input. Conversations, visual images, decisions, emotional reactions. So much of this information is stored temporarily, waiting to be organized and interpreted. Quiet moments provide the conditions for this organization. When external stimulation decreases, brain networks associated with internal reflection become more active. These networks help individuals evaluate past actions, imagine possible futures, and understand their own emotional responses. In other words, silence activates the mind's internal analysis system. But internal analysis can sometimes reveal uncomfortable truths. A person may recognize patterns in their behavior that they would prefer to ignore. They may notice habits that do not align with their long-term goals. They may recall mistakes they have not yet processed. Because of this, distraction becomes an easy escape. Instead of examining a difficult thought, a person scrolls through content. Instead of reflecting on an emotional reaction, they move quickly to the next activity. Over time, this pattern can become automatic. The mind begins to associate silence with discomfort and stimulation with relief. Yet philosophers have long warned about the consequences of this habit. The Stoic teacher Epictetus believed that a person who never examines their own thoughts becomes vulnerable to impulses and external influence. Without reflection, emotions can guide behaviors more strongly than reason. Reflection, in his view, was not an abstract intellectual exercise. It was a practical tool for self-discipline. Another thinker, Ralph Waldo Emerson, often emphasized the importance of trusting one's own reasoning. But he also understood that independent thinking requires time away from the constant opinions of others. When a person is always surrounded by voices, trends, and reactions, their thinking gradually becomes shaped by those influences. Solitude creates a boundary where a person can observe their own thinking without interference. This observation is not always comfortable at first. Imagine meeting someone you have never truly spoken to before, someone whose thoughts and habits you barely understand. Now imagine that this person is actually your own mind. For many people, this is what the first experiences of quiet reflection feel like. Thoughts appear unpredictably. The mind jumps from one memory to another. Old conversations resurface, future worries emerge. Without practice, the mind can feel chaotic. But this chaos is temporary. With repeated exposure to silence, the mind begins to settle. Thoughts become slower and more organized. Instead of reacting automatically, the observer within the mind begins to notice patterns. This process is similar to adjusting to darkness in a quiet room. At first, everything seems unclear, but gradually, shapes become visible. The environment becomes easier to understand. The same thing happens with internal reflection. Once the mind becomes familiar with quiet observation, silence no longer feels threatening. Instead, it becomes useful. A person begins to notice emotional triggers. They recognize recurring thoughts. They identify fears that influence their decisions. And perhaps most importantly, they develop the ability to pause before reacting. This pause is one of the foundations of emotional discipline. Without it, Chain reactions are immediate and impulsive. With it, responses become thoughtful and deliberate. Walking alone, without music, without conversation, without digital distraction, creates ideal conditions for this mental pause. The steady rhythm of movement calms the body. The quiet environment allows thoughts to surface. Gradually, the mind begins to organize itself. Many great thinkers discovered this process through experience. They did not simply sit in isolation for philosophical reasons. They recognized that periods of solitude sharpened their ability to observe human behavior, including their own. Over time, these quiet habits shaped their thinking in powerful ways. In fact, some of the most influential writers, leaders, and philosophers in history deliberately built solitude into their daily routines. They walked alone. They reflected alone. They wrote their thoughts in quiet places away from distraction. Understanding how these individuals used solitude and what they discovered during those quiet hours reveals an important lesson about the power of reflective thinking. And that lesson brings us to the next chapter. Because long before modern psychology studied the benefits of reflection, some of history's most disciplined minds had already learned a simple truth. Solitude, when used wisely, can become one of the greatest tools for strengthening the mind. Solitude in the lives of great thinkers. Across different centuries, cultures, and professions, a quiet pattern appears in the lives of many remarkable thinkers. Despite their influence on society, despite their responsibilities and public roles, they repeatedly return to the same habits, and they spend time alone. This solitude was not accidental, it was deliberate. It was often protected with discipline, almost like a daily ritual. While the world around them was filled with activity, expectations, and constant demands for attention, these individuals understood that clear thinking requires distance from noise. To understand the importance of solitude, it is useful to look at how some historical thinkers treated it, not as isolation, but as a form of mental training. Consider the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius. He ruled one of the largest empires in the ancient world. His days were filled with military decisions, political pressures, and responsibilities that affected millions of people. Yet in the midst of this constant activity, he developed a habit that seems almost surprising for someone in such a powerful position. He regularly withdrew into quiet reflection. His personal writings, later known as meditations, were not intended for public audiences. They were simply notes to himself, observations about discipline, emotional control, and the importance of examining one's own thoughts. In these reflections, he reminded himself that the mind can find calm even in difficult circumstances, but only if it learns to step back and observe its own reactions. This practice of internal observation was strengthened by solitude. Another Roman thinker, Seneca, also believed that a person must occasionally retreat from the crowd in order to preserve clear judgment. He warned that constant exposure to public opinion can slowly influence behavior without a person realizing it. The opinions of the group, the emotions of the crowd, and the pressures of reputation can quietly shape decisions. Solitude, in his view, acted as a reset. It allowed the mind to return to its own reasoning rather than reacting automatically to external voices. But solitude was not limited to ancient philosophers. Centuries later, the French writer Michel de Montaigne built a personal retreat inside a tower library at his home. Surrounded by books and quiet space, he spent long periods reflecting on human behavior. Montaigne believed that one of the most valuable abilities a person could develop was the capacity to observe their own mind honestly. He once described his writing as a process of studying himself, not out of vanity, but out of curiosity about how the human mind functions. Solitude provided the environment for this study. Now, without constant conversation or social performance, the mind becomes easier to observe. Even outside the world of philosophy, many disciplined individuals have used solitude as a tool for mental clarity. The Japanese swordsman and strategist Miyamoto Musashi spent long periods traveling and training alone. During these solitary journeys, he reflected deeply on strategy, discipline, and personal conduct. His later writings reveal a mind that valued independence of thought and careful self-examination. Musashi understood that external battles require internal clarity, and internal clarity often emerges in quiet environments. What connects these individuals is not their profession, their culture, or even the specific philosophies they studied. But what connects them is a shared recognition. The mind becomes stronger when it has time to reflect without interruption. Modern psychology provides additional insight into why this habit was so effective. When a person spends time alone without external stimulation, the brain begins to shift into a mode of internal processing. Memories are reviewed, experiences are interpreted, emotional reactions are analyzed. This process allows individuals to learn from their experiences more effectively. In contrast, when a person moves constantly from one activity to another without reflection, experiences remain unexamined. Mistakes are repeated. Emotions accumulate without understanding. Solitude creates a pause where learning can occur, but there is an important distinction to make. Solitude is not the same as isolation. Isolation occurs when a person is cut off from meaningful relationship and support. It can weaken emotional well-being and reduce motivation. Solitude, however, is chosen. It is a temporary withdrawal from social activity for the purpose of reflection, clarity, or mental recovery. A person may spend time alone in the morning before beginning work. They may walk alone in the evening after a busy day. They may sit quietly for a few minutes without stimulation, simply observing their thoughts. These small periods of solitude can have a powerful cumulative effect. Over time, the mind becomes more familiar with its own patterns. Emotional reactions become easier to recognize. Decisions become less reactive and more deliberate. This is why many thinkers describe solitude as a kind of mental workshop. And it is the place where ideas are organized, judgments are refined, and personal discipline is strengthened. Without this workshop, thoughts remain scattered. With it, the mind becomes more structured. But despite these benefits, many people still confuse solitude with something negative. They associate being alone with rejection, loneliness, or social failure. This misunderstanding prevents them from discovering the advantages that thoughtful solitude can offer. To truly appreciate the power of walking alone and reflecting quietly, we must first understand the difference between two experiences that often appear similar but are psychologically very different. One weakens the mind, the other strengthens it. Understanding this distinction is essential. And because the next chapter explores a subtle but important question. When does being alone become harmful, and when does it become a source of strength? The difference between loneliness and solitude. At first glance, loneliness and solitude appear almost identical. Both involve being alone. Both involve distance from other people. Both take place in quiet environments where conversation and social interaction are absent. Yet psychologically, these two experiences are profoundly different. One weakens the mind, the other strengthens it. To understand the art of walking alone, this distinction must be clear. Loneliness is a feeling of disconnection. It appears when a person desires companionship but cannot find it. The mind begins to interpret isolation as rejection, abandonment, or exclusion. When loneliness takes hold, the mind often drifts toward negative interpretations. A person may begin to believe they are unwanted. They may compare themselves to others and conclude that they are somehow less valued or less successful. These thoughts gradually affect emotional stability. In this state, the mind does not become clearer, it becomes more turbulent. Thoughts repeat themselves without resolution. Emotional reactions grow stronger. Instead of reflection, there is rumination, an endless cycle of worrying and self-doubt. Solitude, however, is something entirely different. Solitude is chosen. It is not a condition forced upon a person by circumstance, but a temporary step away from social interaction in order to think, recover, or examine one's own behavior. The difference lies not in the environment, but in the mindset. Two people may sit alone in the same quiet room. One feels abandoned, the other feels peaceful. The physical situation is identical, but the psychological interpretation is completely different. Solitude allows the mind to breathe. Without constant social performance, without the pressure to respond, impress, or compete, the mind can relax its defenses. It no longer needs to manage how it appears to others. This creates space for honest reflection. The American philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson often wrote about the importance of independent thinking. In his view, individuals must occasionally step away from public opinion in order to understand their own reasoning. Society naturally encourages conformity. People learn to adapt their behavior to fit expectations, trends, and group values. This process is not inherently harmful. Yes, social cooperation is necessary for communities to function. But when social influence becomes constant, something subtle begins to happen. People may lose contact with their own judgment. They begin to think in the language of the group rather than examining ideas independently. Solitude interrupts this process. It provides a space where a person can ask quiet questions without external pressure. What do I truly think about this? Why did I react that way earlier today? Is the direction I'm moving in aligned with my long-term goals? These questions rarely appear when a person is surrounded by conversation and stimulation. But during moments of solitude, while walking alone, sitting quietly, or reflecting at the end of the day, they naturally emerge. At first, these questions may feel unfamiliar, and modern life rarely encourages them. In many environments, productivity is measured by visible activity. Emails answered, meetings attended, tasks completed. Quiet reflection, although essential for good decision-making, often appears unproductive from the outside. Yet reflection is one of the most valuable forms of mental work. Without it, activity becomes mechanical. People may work harder but think less carefully. They may respond quickly but without understanding the deeper consequences of their actions. Solitude restores the balance between action and reflection. It allows the mind to step back from immediate demands and evaluate larger patterns. Psychologically, this process strengthens what researchers often call self-awareness, the ability to observe one's own thoughts, emotions, and behavior. Now, self-awareness is not automatic. It develops gradually when individuals regularly examine their experiences. For example, after a difficult conversation, a person who practices reflection might ask, "Why did that situation create such a strong reaction in me? Was my response helpful or impulsive? What could I handle differently next time?" These questions transform experiences into lessons. Without reflection, experiences simply pass by. Emotions rise and fall without understanding. Mistakes may repeat because they were never examined carefully. This is why solitude often becomes a quiet laboratory for personal growth. Inside the laboratory, the mind studies itself. It identifies patterns. It recognizes habits. It begins to understand how emotions influence decisions. Over time, now this understanding leads to greater emotional discipline. A person who knows their own mental patterns is less likely to be surprised by them. They recognize frustration before it turns into anger. They notice fear before it leads to avoidance. They observe impulses before they turn into action. This awareness creates a small but powerful space between feeling and response. Within that space lies the possibility of choice, and choice is the foundation of self-mastery. But the benefits of solitude extend beyond emotional understanding. There is also a physical rhythm that quietly supports reflective thinking, a rhythm created by movement. Throughout history, many thinkers discovered that their clearest thoughts did not appear while sitting still in crowded rooms. They appeared during long walks. On the steady pace of walking calms the nervous system. It gives the mind time to move slowly through ideas without interruption. And when walking happens in solitude, without conversation, without digital distraction, the effect becomes even stronger. Thoughts unfold naturally, one step at a time. The relationship between walking and thinking is so consistent that many philosophers, writers, and scientists treated walking not as exercise but as an essential part of their thinking process. Understanding why this simple activity has such a powerful effect on the mind leads us to the next chapter. Because the act of walking alone is more than physical movement. It is a quiet method for organizing thoughts. And once we understand how movement influences the mind, we could begin to see why some of humanity's most thoughtful ideas were discovered not in crowded halls, but on long, silent walks. Walking as a tool for thinking. There is something remarkably simple about walking. No complex equipment is required. No special environment is necessary. A person only needs space to move and a few quiet minutes. Yet throughout history, walking has played a surprising role in the thinking process of many disciplined minds. Writers, philosophers, scientists, and leaders often discovered that their clearest thoughts did not appear while sitting at a desk. Instead, clarity often arrived during long walks, especially walks taken alone. At first, this connection between walking and thinking may seem unusual. But when we examine how the human mind and body interact, the reason becomes easier to understand. When the human brain evolved alongside physical movement. For thousands of years, people spent large portions of their day walking across fields, through forests, between villages, or along trade routes. During these journeys, the mind naturally processed information about the environment, potential dangers, and social relationships. Movement and thinking develop together. In modern life, however, many people spend long hours sitting in front of screens, absorbing information without physical movement. This creates a disconnect between the body and the mind. Walking restores that connection. When a person walks at a steady pace, the body enters a calm and balanced rhythm. breathing becomes more regular. Muscles move in predictable patterns. The nervous system gradually shifts into a more relaxed state. And this physical rhythm has a quiet but powerful effect on mental activity. Instead of jumping rapidly from one stimulus to another, the mind begins to slow down. Thoughts become more continuous and less fragmented. Imagine the difference between a crowded marketplace and a quiet path through a park. In the marketplace, attention is constantly pulled in different directions. Voices, colors, sounds, and movement compete for focus. The mind must react quickly to each new signal. On the quiet path, however, attention is free to wander inward. Walking alone creates a similar mental environment. Without conversation, without digital alerts, without constant demands for response, the mind begins to unfold its thoughts gradually. This is why many thinkers developed a habit of walking while reflecting. And the French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau famously described how his most meaningful ideas often appeared during long solitary walks. Away from social pressures, he found that movement helped him think more clearly about human behavior and society. Similarly, the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche believed that profound ideas were closely connected to movement. He once suggested that only thoughts discovered while walking truly had vitality. Although his statement may sound dramatic, it reflects a real psychological observation. Movement changes how the brain processes information. Research in cognitive psychology has shown that light physical activity, such as walking, can increase creativity and problem-solving ability. When the body moves steadily, the brain becomes more flexible in its thinking patterns. Ideas that seem blocked while sitting may suddenly appear during a walk. Problems that felt overwhelming may become easier to examine. But walking offers more than creativity. It also supports reflection. Consider what happens when someone walks alone without music or digital distraction. The environment provides gentle stimulation, the movement of trees, the rhythm of footsteps, the sound of wind or distant activity. These subtle signals keep the mind engaged without overwhelming it. Because the stimulation is mild and predictable, the brain has room to explore deeper thoughts. Memories surface, questions appear, emotions connected to past experiences begin to reveal themselves. Walking creates a natural pace for thinking. Each step becomes a small pause in which the mind continues its internal conversation. And this is why many people report that the most honest thoughts appear while walking alone. In the quiet rhythm of movement, the mind feels less pressure to perform or defend itself. It becomes easier to admit uncertainty, reconsider past decisions, or imagine new possibilities. Walking also removes a common barrier to reflection, the sense of urgency. When someone sits at a desk, there is often a task waiting to be completed. The mind feels pressure to produce results quickly. Reflection becomes secondary to productivity. During a walk, however, there is no immediate demand for output. The goal is simply movement. This removes the pressure to solve problems instantly. Instead of forcing solutions, the mind is allowed to explore ideas gradually. Ironically, this relaxed exploration often leads to clearer conclusions than hurried analysis. Walking also encourages a particular form of attention known as open awareness. In open awareness, the mind is attentive, but not narrowly focused on a single task. It moves freely between observations, memories, and ideas. This flexible attention allows connections to form between thoughts that might otherwise remain separate. A person might begin a walk thinking about a work problem, then recall a conversation from earlier in the week, then notice a pattern in their own reactions. Slowly, these pieces begin to connect. By the end of the walk, what began as scattered thoughts may form a clearer understanding. This process is not dramatic. It happens quietly step by step, but over weeks and months, these quiet walks can significantly strengthen a person's ability to think clearly. The mind becomes more comfortable with reflection. Decisions become less reactive. Emotional responses become easier to observe and regulate. Walking alone becomes a small daily training session for the mind. Yet in the modern world, this simple habit is becoming increasingly rare. Even during walks, many people surround themselves with constant audio, podcasts, music, or phone conversations. While these activities can be enjoyable, they remove the quiet space that allows deeper reflection to occur. In a culture filled with stimulation, the discipline to walk without distraction has become surprisingly powerful. Because the real value of walking alone is not physical exercise, it is mental clarity. And as we move further into an era of constant information and digital noise, the ability to create quiet thinking space may become more valuable than ever before. To understand why this challenge is growing, we must examine a deeper problem shaping modern life. The human mind today is exposed to more stimulation than at any other point in history. And this constant stimulation is quietly changing the way people think. The mind under constant stimulation. In the modern era, our attention has become one of the most contested territories in human life. Everywhere we turn, stimuli compete for focus. Notifications ping from smartphones. News headlines demand immediate reading. Social media feeds scroll endlessly. Advertisements flash across screens, and messages arrive from dozens of sources simultaneously. Now, this constant barrage is not merely a matter of convenience or entertainment. It subtly reshapes the way the mind operates. The human brain is wired to respond to novelty. When something unexpected appears, an alert, a new image, a sudden sound, the brain registers it as significant, releasing neurotransmitters that reward attention. This system helped our ancestors respond to threats in the environment, but in modern society it has become a source of constant distraction. The psychological result is that the mind becomes restless. Moments of silence, previously natural and even necessary, now feel empty or uncomfortable. The brain has become conditioned to expect a steady stream of input, and without it, anxiety or boredom often emerge. In essence, constant stimulation erodes the very ability to focus deeply. And when attention is fragmented, thoughts cannot develop fully. Ideas are interrupted, reflections are cut short, and emotional processing is hindered. A person may feel busy yet unproductive, active yet unclear, constantly engaged yet fundamentally disconnected from their own reasoning. This is why periods of solitude and walking alone are so essential. They provide a rare opportunity for the mind to recover, to integrate information, and to regain coherence. Consider the psychological phenomenon of attention residue. When people multitask or shift rapidly from one source of stimulation to another, part of their mind remains occupied with the previous task. This residue reduces cognitive efficiency, making each subsequent thought or task less effective. In other words, constantly switching attention diminishes clarity, creativity, and mental discipline. Historical thinkers were aware of this, though they lacked modern neuroscience terminology. Montaigne, for example, deliberately created daily periods of quiet reflection in his Tower library. he recognized that the bombardment of social and civic duties could cloud judgment and inhibit clear thinking. By retreating, he allowed his mind the space to process, organize, and ultimately generate more coherent insights. Even today, the effects are striking. Individuals who spend prolonged periods immersed in digital stimulation often report feeling mentally fatigued, emotionally reactive, or indecisive. They may struggle to engage in deep thinking, lose the ability to reflect critically, or find themselves trapped in cycles of repetitive, shallow thought. The solution, though simple in principle, requires deliberate practice, creating intentional space for reflection. Walking alone, sitting without distractions, or even allowing oneself short periods of unoccupied thought activates neural networks responsible for introspection, memory consolidation, and self-regulation. These networks thrive not under constant stimulation, but under calm, deliberate conditions. Furthermore, solitude provides a kind of psychological contrast. By stepping away from perpetual input, the mind experiences relief from overstimulation. Freed from the need to constantly react, it can examine patterns in behavior, emotions, and thought processes. This is how long-term thinking emerges. The brain begins to connect past experiences with current decisions and future possibilities. Yet the transition is rarely easy. And because the mind has been conditioned to chase novelty, the first attempts at quiet reflection can feel strange, even uncomfortable. Thoughts may drift uncontrollably, anxieties may rise, and restlessness may appear. Many interpret this discomfort as a sign that solitude is unproductive. In reality, it signals the mind is reawakening to its natural capacity for self-observation. The psychological mechanism behind this is linked to the brain's default mode network, a set of interconnected regions that becomes active during periods of rest or low external input. This network facilitates self-reflection, creative problem-solving, and the mental rehearsal of experiences. When the brain is continuously bombarded by stimuli, this network remains suppressed, and the benefits of reflection are lost. And understanding this connection helps explain why historical thinkers consistently valued solitude and walking. They had learned, perhaps intuitively, that mental clarity and disciplined thought cannot coexist with constant noise. The mind needs pauses, the body needs rhythm, and the brain needs unbroken space for introspection. It is also why modern individuals who practice walking alone, free from digital intrusion, report enhanced focus, emotional resilience, and greater creativity. Each step, each quiet moment becomes a small but deliberate act of cognitive restoration. The lesson here is profound. To strengthen the mind, it is not enough to act or to think in fragments. One must intentionally step away from distraction, create space for reflection, and allow thoughts to unfold naturally. This habit cultivates depth, clarity, and a disciplined approach to both action and observation. The next chapter will explore precisely how this process unfolds. How, in solitude, a person begins to observe their own mind, identify patterns, and cultivate awareness that supports emotional control and self-mastery, learning to observe your own mind. In solitude, a subtle shift occurs. The noise of the world fades, and what remains is the constant, quiet presence of one's own thoughts. At first, this can feel uncomfortable, even chaotic. The mind, unaccustomed to uninterrupted reflection, may wander between memories, worries, and fleeting impressions. Yet within this wandering lies a profound opportunity, the chance to observe one's own mental processes with clarity. Observation of the mind is not a passive activity. It is an active engagement in self-awareness. Can a deliberate attention to how thoughts arise, how emotions emerge, and how impulses influence behavior. In modern life, this practice is increasingly rare. People rarely allow themselves the time to notice the patterns shaping their decisions or the subtle undercurrents of their emotional life. Instead, they respond automatically, guided by habit, distraction, or external influence. The philosophical roots of this practice stretch back centuries. The Stoic thinkers, for instance, emphasize constant self-examination as the foundation of personal discipline. Epictetus encouraged individuals to become their own observer, to step back from events and evaluate not just what happened, but how they responded. His central insight was simple. While external events may be beyond our control, the mind's reaction is always within our power. And from a psychological perspective, observing one's own thoughts strengthens a network of cognitive and emotional functions. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for decision-making, planning, and impulse control, becomes more active. Patterns of automatic reactive thought are interrupted. Emotional responses, once reflexive, are examined before they translate into action. Over time, this builds a form of mental resilience, a stability of consciousness that allows a person to navigate challenges without being swept away by emotion. Consider a simple exercise, walking alone in a quiet park. At first, the mind may jump from one distraction to another. Passing car, an errant memory, a thought about a future task. But with consistent attention, one begins to notice patterns. Perhaps irritation always arises in specific situations, or anxiety flares around certain uncertainties. By observing these mental tendencies without judgment, one gains insight into the triggers shaping daily behavior. This awareness transforms the relationship with one's own thoughts. Instead of being carried along by them, the individual becomes a participant in the thinking process. The mind becomes a subject of study rather than a master of behavior. Thoughts are examined, emotions are tracked, and habitual reactions are understood. In other words, the observer within the mind begins to awaken. Historical figures understood this implicitly. Miyamoto Musashi, for example, emphasized the importance of observing not only opponents, but also one's own responses during training and battle. And the principle extends beyond combat. Awareness of internal patterns allows for greater mastery of choices, actions, and emotional stability in any domain of life. Modern psychology supports this ancient insight. Studies on mindfulness and self-reflection indicate that the act of observing one's own mental activity without immediate reaction enhances cognitive flexibility, reduces impulsivity, and strengthens long-term planning abilities. The brain learns to notice distractions, acknowledge them, and return to deliberate thought. This is the foundation of emotional intelligence and self-mastery. Observation is also cumulative. The more time spent in quiet reflection, the more accurate and nuanced the understanding of the self becomes. One begins to notice recurring patterns, reactions to stress, tendencies toward impatience, habitual interpretations of others' behavior. With repeated observation, these patterns can be altered. The mind becomes a tool rather than a reflexive agent of impulse. Yet the practice requires patience. At first, the mind may resist, seeking distraction in the familiar. Thoughts may race or linger on unresolved worries. Emotions may surface that have been suppressed during the rush of daily life. These reactions are not obstacles. They are evidence that the mind is alive and that reflection is beginning to reveal its natural rhythms. Solitude provides the ideal environment for this internal observation. There is no external expectation, no immediate demand for output, and no competing voices. This freedom allows the mind to examine itself in a sustained and deliberate manner. Over time, the individual develops not only clarity but also emotional discipline, the ability to respond to situations intentionally rather than reflexively. The implications are profound. When one can observe thoughts and emotions consistently, decisions improve. Relationships become more balanced because reactions are measured. Work and personal projects benefit from strategic thought rather than impulsive behavior. In essence, observing the mind is the cornerstone of self-mastery. The next step in this process, which emerges naturally after observation, is learning to manage emotions effectively. Once patterns are visible, they can be addressed. Emotional discipline, one of the most valuable outcomes of solitude, depends on the awareness cultivated through quiet reflection and careful observation. Emotional discipline in solitude. Time alone often reveals truths that the busy mind tends to ignore. In solitude, emotions that were previously suppressed or overlooked come to the surface. Frustrations that were buried beneath work and social obligations, anxieties masked by constant activity or lingering resentment from past interactions, all emerge, quietly demanding recognition. This is the first test of emotional discipline, the ability to observe feelings without being overwhelmed by them. Many people mistake emotional intensity in solitude as a sign of weakness. They feel that if emotions arise, they must act immediately, vent or distract themselves. Yet the opposite is true. Emotions are signals, and when approached with calm awareness, they become tools for self-understanding rather than instruments of impulsive action. That the solitary mind has the unique capacity to engage with these signals deliberately. Historical thinkers often emphasize this point. Seneca argued that self-control is not achieved by suppressing feelings, but by understanding them. He observed that emotional reactions can cloud judgment, but through reflection and disciplined attention, individuals can choose how to respond rather than being dictated by impulse. The same principle is central to the practice of walking alone or spending time in quiet reflection. The mind learns to recognize feelings without immediately acting on them. Psychologically, emotions are deeply tied to survival mechanisms. Anxiety alerts us to potential threats. Anger signals perceived injustice, and sadness reflects unmet needs or losses. In the bustle of daily life, these signals are often ignored or avoided, leading to emotional buildup. Over time, suppressed emotions can intensify, manifesting in stress, irritability, or hasty decision-making. Solitude creates a controlled environment where the mind can process these signals safely. Walking alone, for instance, allows the body and mind to synchronize. The rhythmic motion of footsteps, the measured pace of breathing, and the gentle awareness of one's surroundings all combine to regulate the nervous system. In this state, the mind becomes capable of observing emotional patterns without being hijacked by them. Anxiety may appear, but instead of immediately reacting, the individual can note, "I feel anxious. Why does this arise? What does it signal?" Over time, this practice builds emotional resilience. Now the mind learns that emotions are transient. They appear, shift, and pass. By observing without immediate reaction, a person strengthens the ability to respond deliberately. Choices become guided by reason and long-term objectives rather than fleeting impulses. This discipline also affects relationships and social interactions. A person who has cultivated emotional awareness in solitude is less likely to overreact in conversation, less likely to project frustration onto others, and better able to communicate with clarity. In essence, solitude acts as a rehearsal space for life, a safe place to train the mind in managing its internal states before encountering external pressures. The benefits of emotional discipline extend to decision-making as well. Many impulsive actions are driven by unchecked emotions. By observing and understanding these internal cues during moments of solitude, a person develops the capacity to pause, evaluate, and act with intention. This creates a feedback loop. The more one practices self-observation in quiet reflection, the more naturally emotional regulation becomes in everyday life. Walking alone, then, is not merely a physical exercise. It is a mental and emotional one. The repeated act of confronting one's own thoughts and feelings strengthens the mind's executive control systems, the parts responsible for planning, prioritization, and self-regulation. Over weeks and months, the effects accumulate. Greater patience, improved clarity, and a stable inner state even in challenging circumstances. Yet emotional discipline is not about eliminating feelings. Rather, it is about creating a space where feelings can be observed, understood, and used constructively. Anger becomes insight into boundaries, anxiety signals a need for preparation, and sadness invites reflection and healing. Solitude transforms these raw experiences into structured awareness. This process naturally leads to a more profound level of independence. The ability to make decisions and form judgments without relying on external approval or guidance. Once emotions are observed and understood, they no longer compel automatic reactions influenced by social pressures. The individual learns to act in alignment with personal values rather than temporary impulses. This realization prepares the mind for one of the most challenging aspects of modern life, resisting the constant pull of social validation. In a world dominated by feedback, comparison, and approval, seeking emotional discipline cultivated in solitude becomes the foundation for independent thought, a skill that allows a person to stand firm amidst external pressures. The next chapter explores precisely this theme, how solitude strengthens independent thinking and reduces dependence on social approval, enabling individuals to act according to their own reasoned judgment rather than the fleeting opinions of others. Independence from social approval. Human beings are inherently social creatures. Our survival historically depended on belonging to a group, cooperating with others, and aligning behavior with social norms. Yet this natural inclination toward connection comes with a subtle cost. The mind often begins to seek approval, validation, or acceptance from others. It is sometimes at the expense of independent thought. In modern society, this drive is amplified. Social media, workplace hierarchies, and constant peer comparison encourage people to measure their worth externally. Likes, comments, and recognition become psychological currency. Over time, decisions, both trivial and profound, can become shaped more by perceived social judgment than by personal reasoning. Walking alone in silence creates a rare and essential contrast. Removed from the immediate influence of others, the mind is no longer responding to external cues. It is free to consider ideas, evaluate choices, and explore perspectives without the pressure of validation. Solitude fosters independence by providing a safe environment in which internal judgment can operate unimpeded. Philosophers have long recognized this dynamic. Emerson emphasized the importance of self-reliance, arguing that one must trust personal insight rather than the often conflicting opinions of society. For Emerson, the cultivation of an internal compass, an ability to assess one's thoughts and actions independently, was foundational to true personal growth. The psychological mechanism behind this effect is tied to the brain's reward system. Social approval activates dopamine pathways, creating feelings of pleasure when recognition is received. While this is natural and adaptive, over-reliance on external rewards can weaken internal decision-making. Solitude interrupts this cycle. Without external reinforcement, the mind learns to evaluate choices on criteria beyond popularity, prestige, or immediate reward. This independence is not about rejecting society. Social connections remain essential for cooperation, empathy, and shared experience. Rather, it is about establishing a primary point of reference within one's own mind. The ability to judge situations, respond to challenges, and make decisions without constant social feedback cultivates confidence, clarity, and resilience. Historical thinkers illustrate this point vividly. Miyamoto Musashi traveled alone for much of his life, developing strategies, skills, and philosophies in solitude. By removing the constant influence of peers and social pressures, he honed independent judgment, allowing him to act decisively even in high-stakes circumstances. Modern psychology supports this insight. Individuals with strong self-reliance, those capable of independent thought, tend to show higher levels of resilience, emotional stability, and long-term planning. They are less likely to be swayed by peer pressure, trends, or the fear of judgment. Solitude as a practice strengthens the neural circuits involved in executive function, planning, and self-evaluation. Walking alone, therefore, serves as a daily training ground for independence. Each step taken in quiet reflection reinforces the mind's ability to trust its own judgment. Decisions become guided by reason and principle, rather than by fleeting social cues. Over time, the individual experiences a subtle but profound shift. Freedom from the compulsion to please others becomes a foundation for deliberate action and mental strength. This independence also nurtures authenticity. When the mind is free from the constant influence of external approval, and the individual can align behavior with personal values rather than performative expectations, actions become intentional rather than reactive, and life choices reflect genuine priorities rather than social conformity. Yet independence is not innate. Most people must cultivate it deliberately, and solitude is one of the most reliable tools for doing so. By stepping away from the noise, observing their own thoughts, and practicing reflection during moments alone, individuals train the mind to operate from internal guidance rather than external influence. The ability to act independently has further implications for resilience and long-term planning. By reducing dependence on immediate approval, a person can pursue difficult goals, withstand criticism, and remain committed to long-term objectives without being distracted by the fluctuating opinions of others. The next chapter will examine this connection between solitude and resilience more closely. It will explore how walking alone, observing one's thoughts, and practicing independence collectively cultivate the mental fortitude necessary to navigate life's inevitable challenges, building resilience. Through solitude, resilience is often misunderstood as mere toughness or the ability to endure hardship. While endurance is part of it, true resilience involves a more subtle capacity, the ability to remain clear-minded, self-aware, and deliberate when confronted with challenges. Solitude, particularly the quiet reflection and walking alone we have explored, is a powerful tool in cultivating this form of resilience. And life is unpredictable. Difficulties arise without warning. Unexpected setbacks at work, strained relationships, health concerns, or sudden losses. The mind's natural reaction is often reactive, panic, frustration, or avoidance. Those who have never learned to observe their own thoughts may find themselves swept along by these emotions, unable to pause, reflect, or respond strategically. Solitude offers a counterbalance. By spending time alone and observing the mind, a person gradually develops the capacity to face internal and external challenges without being overwhelmed. Emotional responses become noticeable before they dictate behavior. Thought patterns that previously reinforced stress or self-doubt are identified and addressed. Over time, these moments of quiet reflection strengthen the mind's capacity to remain steady under pressure. Consider the psychological concept of emotional granularity, the ability to distinguish between subtle differences in emotional states. Individuals who cultivate this skill respond to challenges more effectively because they can identify precisely what they are feeling, rather than lumping emotions into broad categories like anger or anxiety. Walking alone and spending time in reflection naturally cultivates this skill because it allows the mind to explore emotions without distraction or suppression. Historical examples illustrate the link between solitude and resilience. Marcus Aurelius, despite ruling a vast empire under constant pressure, maintained daily periods of reflection, and these quiet moments provided him the stability to make thoughtful decisions amidst political turmoil, military crises, and personal loss. His resilience was not innate, it was trained through disciplined self-examination and mental solitude. Similarly, Seneca emphasized that adversity is not inherently harmful. The mind's reaction to adversity determines its impact. By practicing solitude, he trained himself to observe challenges calmly, to weigh responses carefully, and to prevent emotional turbulence from clouding judgment. Modern research supports these ancient insights. Solitary reflection activates neural pathways associated with executive function, problem-solving, and self-regulation. The mind learns to recognize habitual reactions, evaluate potential responses, and choose actions that align with long-term goals. Essentially, solitude acts as a mental gymnasium. Regular practice strengthens cognitive and emotional muscles that are critical for resilience. Resilience built through solitude has practical implications. When challenges arise, the person can pause, reflect, and respond with deliberation rather than impulsivity. This does not eliminate difficulty, but it prevents compounding mistakes fueled by reactive emotion. It allows individuals to maintain perspective, regulate stress, and adapt strategies to complex situations. Walking alone magnifies this effect. The rhythm of steps, combined with a quiet environment, creates a feedback loop between body and mind. The steady motion soothes the nervous system while the mind explores ideas and emotions. Problems are not forced to resolution. They are allowed to unfold naturally, often revealing insights that are inaccessible during periods of distraction or constant stimulation. Through repeated practice, solitude teaches an important lesson about control. The mind cannot control every circumstance, but it can control how it interprets and responds to circumstances. This distinction is central to resilience. By learning to act with awareness rather than reaction, a person becomes less vulnerable to stressors and more capable of sustaining effort over time. The benefits are cumulative. Emotional awareness, independence from social approval, and reflective thinking all converge within solitude to create a mind that is both adaptable and steady. The person who walks alone, observes their thoughts, and confronts emotions with calm attention develops the mental infrastructure needed to endure life's challenges while maintaining clarity and purpose. Yet resilience is not merely defensive, it also enables proactive growth. Solitude provides the mental space to anticipate potential challenges, to consider multiple outcomes, and to prepare strategically. By cultivating awareness and emotional discipline in calm conditions, the mind becomes capable of acting decisively when the situation demands it. The next chapter will explore how solitude and reflective walking contribute not only to resilience, but also to the long-term transformation of identity. How deliberate introspection shapes the individual over time into a person of clarity, self-mastery, and purpose. Transforming identity through reflection. Identity is not a fixed entity. It is a process continuously shaped by experiences, choices, and the patterns of thought we reinforce over time. Yet in the rush of modern life, many people unconsciously allow external influences to dictate who they are. Social pressures, cultural expectations, and habitual routines quietly mold behavior, often leaving little room for deliberate self-definition. Solitude, particularly when combined with reflective walking, offers a unique opportunity to consciously shape one's identity. When a person spends time alone observing their own mind, a subtle but profound change begins. Thoughts and emotions that were once reactive become objects of study. Patterns of behavior, both constructive and destructive, are recognized. Repeated reflection allows the individual to discern which impulses align with their long-term goals and values, and which arise from habit, fear, or external influence. Over time, these observations inform deliberate choices that redefine identity. The psychological principle underlying this transformation is self-concept clarity, the degree to which a person's beliefs about themselves are clearly and confidently defined. High self-concept clarity correlates with emotional stability, resilience, and the ability to pursue meaningful goals. Solitude strengthens this clarity by reducing the noise of external opinion, allowing internal evaluation to guide behavior. Without constant input from the surrounding world, the mind is free to ask, who do I want to be? What kind of person do I wish to become? Historical thinkers understood this intuitively. Michel de Montaigne emphasized that understanding oneself required deliberate withdrawal from the world's distractions. By observing his thoughts and impulse in isolation, he developed insight into human nature, including his own tendencies. This knowledge allowed him to act with intentionality rather than reactivity, gradually cultivating an identity aligned with reasoned principles rather than external expectation. Similarly, Marcus Aurelius used daily reflection to evaluate his responses and refine his character. Through journaling and meditation, he continuously aligned his actions with his conception of virtue and duty. Each moment of observation was a small act of identity shaping, reinforcing qualities like discipline, patience, and resilience. Modern psychology reinforces these ancient practices. Then self-reflection strengthens metacognition, the ability to think about one's own thinking. This capability is critical for identity development. When an individual can observe their mental patterns, evaluate their consistency with personal values, and adjust behavior accordingly, they exercise authorship over their own identity. Over time, repeated cycles of reflection and adjustment gradually reshape how a person perceives themselves and how they act in the world. Walking alone amplifies this process. The rhythmic motion of walking creates a steady meditative backdrop for mental exploration. Thoughts are given space to develop, emotions are observed, and self-assessment occurs naturally. Unlike sitting in a cluttered environment, walking provides both physical and mental momentum. Ideas flow more freely, and reflection becomes dynamic rather than static. The transformation of identity through solitude is gradual but enduring. It does not happen in a single day or through one walk. It is built step by step, thought by thought. Each act of deliberate observation, each moment of self-directed reflection strengthens the internal narrative of the self, aligning actions with chosen principles. Over months and years, this consistent practice produces a person who is more conscious of their motivations, more capable of emotional regulation, and more aligned with long-term goals. Importantly, identity transformation through solitude does not require radical isolation or disengagement from life. Rather, it thrives in balance. Social interactions, challenges, and responsibilities provide the experiences from which reflection draws its insights. Yet solitude merely creates the mental space needed to integrate those experiences, evaluate choices, and consciously shape behavior. Ultimately, walking alone and reflecting in solitude is a form of self-cultivation. It trains the mind to observe, understand, and refine itself. It allows individuals to shed automatic patterns of thought and behavior imposed by habit or external pressures and replace them with deliberate, conscious choices. In this sense, solitude is not emptiness. It is the workshop of the self. The next chapter will explore how this cultivated self-awareness and disciplined identity can be applied to long-term planning and strategic thinking, enabling individuals to align daily habits with larger life goals. Long-term thinking and the solitary mind. The capacity for long-term thinking distinguishes individuals who act with foresight from those who remain trapped by immediate impulses. Yet in a world dominated by instant gratification, digital distraction, and rapid social feedback, cultivating this perspective is increasingly difficult. Solitude, particularly through practices like walking alone, provides the mental space necessary to observe, evaluate, and plan for the future with clarity and intention. Long-term thinking requires more than mere planning. It demands patience, reflection, and the ability to delay immediate desires in favor of enduring goals. The mind must step back from the pool of short-term stimuli and examine patterns across time. How present actions influence future outcomes, or how repeated decisions compound into results, and how personal growth unfolds gradually rather than instantaneously. Solitude nurtures these capabilities by creating uninterrupted cognitive space. Psychologically, the solitary mind is better able to engage in what cognitive scientists call prospective cognition, the ability to simulate possible futures, evaluate potential outcomes, and mentally rehearse strategies. When the mind is constantly bombarded with notifications, social pressures, and competing tasks, prospective thinking is diminished. Walking alone restores it. The rhythm of steps and the quiet of the environment allow the mind to travel forward in thought, to weigh the consequences of decisions and to visualize paths toward long-term objectives. Historical thinkers recognize the value of this practice, and Seneca emphasized that preparation for future challenges is a defining feature of wisdom. He urged individuals to anticipate trials, reflect on potential difficulties, and develop mental strategies for coping. Walking alone or engaging in solitude offered the perfect environment to cultivate this kind of foresight, free from the distraction of immediate social demands. Similarly, Miyamoto Musashi used solitary practice not merely to perfect physical skills, but to anticipate scenarios, refine tactics, and internalize strategies that would serve him over the long course of his life. His success rested not on immediate victories alone, but on an ongoing capacity to think ahead, adapt, and maintain discipline over years of training and practice. The act of walking alone reinforces long-term thinking through both reflection and rhythm. On the steady cadence of movement stabilizes the mind, reducing reactive emotional responses and fostering sustained attention. This allows the brain to examine patterns in behavior, consider past decisions, and project potential outcomes with clarity. Each step becomes a marker in a mental journey, not only across physical space but across temporal space, linking present actions to future consequences. Long-term thinking cultivated in solitude also supports emotional resilience. By considering potential challenges in advance, the mind prepares for adversity, reducing panic or impulsive reactions when difficulties arise. The foresight gained through reflection allows decisions to be grounded in reason rather than fleeting emotion, cultivating patience, perseverance, and a sense of agency. Moreover, the solitary mind can integrate multiple dimensions of experience. Observations of one's emotional patterns, understanding of habits, and reflections on personal values all inform strategic decisions. This integration creates alignment between daily actions and overarching goals. Habits are no longer mindless routines. They become deliberate steps toward a consciously defined future. In practice, long-term thinking, nurtured in solitude, transforms ordinary life. A walk that begins as a simple exercise becomes a space to weigh career decisions, assess relationships, plan personal growth, or evaluate ethical choices. Repeated over time, these moments create a mental architecture capable of supporting sustained progress and adaptive decision-making. Yet, like other benefits of solitude, long-term thinking requires discipline. Now, the mind must resist the lure of immediate distraction, the impulse to seek approval, or the habitual focus on trivial concerns. It must cultivate patience and trust in the slow unfolding of insight. In doing so, individuals gradually develop not only foresight but also the inner stability necessary to act according to reason rather than compulsion. Ultimately, the solitary mind is a laboratory for the cultivation of wisdom. Walking alone, observing thought patterns, practicing emotional discipline, and engaging in deliberate reflection together build the capacity for strategic, long-term thought. It is here that the individual learns to connect daily actions with future outcomes, to anticipate challenges, and to act with foresight, resilience, and clarity. The next chapter will examine how the integration of solitude, reflection, and long-term thinking culminates in the art of self-mastery, allowing individuals to navigate life with intention, composure, and mental strength. The art of self-mastery, Self-mastery is often described as the pinnacle of personal development, the ability to govern one's own mind, emotions, and actions with deliberate intention. Yet it is not a sudden achievement nor an abstract ideal. Rather, it emerges gradually from consistent practice, reflection, and discipline. Solitude and reflective walking, as we have explored, form a foundation upon which self-mastery is built. To understand self-mastery, one must first recognize the dynamics at play in the human mind. Thoughts arise constantly, emotions fluctuate unpredictably, and impulses often demand immediate attention. Left unchecked, these forces can dictate behavior, resulting in reactionary decisions, wasted energy, and unfulfilled potential. Self-mastery, therefore, is not the suppression of these internal experiences. It is the cultivation of the ability to observe, regulate, and channel them toward deliberate action. Walking alone provides the ideal environment for this cultivation. The rhythm of footsteps, combined with the quiet of solitude, creates a steady mental backdrop. Thoughts can be observed without interference. Emotions can be noticed without acting upon them impulsively. Over time, this habitual reflection strengthens the neural pathways responsible for self-control, attention, and strategic thinking. Each solitary walk becomes a micro-practice in directing the mind rather than being directed by it. Philosophers throughout history have emphasized similar principles. Epictetus taught that the ultimate freedom lies in the mastery of one's own mind. External circumstances may be beyond control, but the conscious regulation of thought, judgment, and response remains entirely within an individual's power. Solitude creates the necessary conditions to practice this principle consistently, away from the distractions and pressures of social life. Psychologically, self-mastery develops through a cycle of observation, understanding, and adjustment. First, the individual observes their own mental and emotional patterns, recognizing impulses, habitual responses, and recurring thought loops. Second, understanding arises. The person discerns which patterns serve long-term goals and which undermine them. Finally, adjustment occurs through deliberate action, or replacing unproductive habits with intentional behavior aligned with values and objectives. The solitary mind also strengthens patience, a critical component of self-mastery. Life rarely unfolds in a straight line, and challenges often demand sustained effort over long periods. By practicing patience during reflection, learning to tolerate the discomfort of unstructured thought, and resisting the compulsion for immediate gratification, the individual cultivates the mental endurance necessary to pursue meaningful goals without being distracted by fleeting desires or external pressures. Historical figures illustrate this process vividly. Marcus Aurelius, for instance, maintained a lifelong regimen of self-reflection, journaling, and internal dialogue. And these solitary practices allowed him to maintain composure and moral clarity even amidst political turmoil and personal loss. His ability to govern his inner life exemplifies how consistent solitary reflection can translate into practical mastery of thought and action. Modern psychological research echoes these insights. Self-mastery is closely linked to executive function, the brain's ability to plan, regulate attention, and inhibit impulsive behavior. Studies indicate that individuals who engage in reflective practices, including walking alone or mindfulness exercises, demonstrate improved decision-making, emotional regulation, and long-term goal achievement. Solitude is thus not merely a retreat. It is an active training ground for the mind's most critical functions. Importantly, self-mastery is holistic. That it integrates emotional discipline, awareness of thought patterns, independence from social approval, and the capacity for long-term thinking. Each element strengthens the others. Emotional control allows clearer reflection. Independence frees the mind from distraction. Foresight guides deliberate choices. The cumulative effect is a mind capable of responding to life with composure, clarity, and intention. Yet self-mastery is not a final destination. It is an ongoing practice, refined continuously through experience, reflection, and solitude. Each walk, each period of quiet reflection reinforces the internal mechanisms that sustain composure, insight, and deliberate action. In this sense, the art of walking alone becomes a daily laboratory for personal growth, a space where the mind is trained to observe, adjust, and refine itself steadily over time. The next chapter will explore how the principles of solitude and self-mastery can be applied to navigate uncertainty and change. How a disciplined mind remains steady, resilient, and adaptive amidst life's inevitable fluctuations. Navigating uncertainty with a disciplined mind. Life is, by its very nature, unpredictable. Circumstances shift without warning, plans falter, relationships change, and the future remains inherently unknowable. For many, this uncertainty produces anxiety, impulsivity, or indecision. Yet for those who cultivate a disciplined mind through solitude, walking, and reflective practice, uncertainty becomes less threatening, not because it disappears, but because the mind is prepared to respond with composure and clarity. So a disciplined mind does not seek control over every external event. Rather, it recognizes that external circumstances are often beyond influence. What is controllable is the internal state. How one interprets events, regulates emotions, and chooses responses. This distinction is central to psychological resilience and lies at the heart of philosophical traditions such as Stoicism. Epictetus emphasized that while we cannot govern fate, we can govern our judgments, desires, and aversions. Solitude provides the space to internalize this principle, free from the noise of the outside world. Walking alone offers a practical method to confront uncertainty. As one moves through quiet spaces, the mind naturally begins to simulate scenarios, anticipate challenges, and weigh options. The rhythm of movement fosters calm attention, allowing thoughts to unfold methodically rather than chaotically. Anxiety diminishes when the mind is trained to focus on observation and reflection instead of reacting impulsively to imagined threats. Psychologically, this capacity arises from strengthened executive function and metacognitive awareness. The brain learns to notice emotional responses, evaluate their usefulness, and decide whether action is required. This creates a buffer between stimulus and reaction. Instead of being swept into reactive cycles of fear or frustration, the individual can approach uncertainty with intentionality and composure. Historical examples provide powerful illustrations. Marcus Aurelius ruled an empire fraught with political turmoil, invasions, and personal tragedy. Yet his habitual practice of reflection and solitary observation enabled him to respond thoughtfully, maintain ethical consistency, and sustain leadership under pressure. Similarly, Miyamoto Musashi prepared for conflict through disciplined solitude and rigorous internal rehearsal, allowing him to navigate unpredictable situations with calm precision. Modern life, though different in its challenges, requires the same fundamental skill: the ability to remain steady, in the face of unpredictability. Constant stimulation and rapid information flow often exacerbate feelings of uncertainty, fragmenting attention and provoking impulsive reactions. Solitude and reflective practice counteract this by strengthening the mind's capacity for deliberate observation, emotional regulation, and long-term planning. Some of the benefits are both practical and profound. A person who has cultivated a disciplined mind is more likely to make measured decisions, respond thoughtfully to change, and maintain perspective during crises. Emotional volatility diminishes, focus improves, and the ability to act in alignment with values strengthens. Challenges that might have seemed overwhelming become manageable because the mind has learned to respond rather than react. Walking alone also fosters adaptive thinking. The quiet space allows the mind to explore multiple possibilities, consider alternative strategies, and anticipate outcomes without immediate pressure. By rehearsing scenarios mentally, the individual builds cognitive flexibility, a crucial skill when confronting unexpected events. Over time, this capacity becomes second nature, allowing the mind to navigate uncertainty with confidence and composure. Moreover, the disciplined mind cultivated through solitude promotes a sense of internal stability. External circumstances fluctuate, but the individual remains anchored in observation, reflection, and deliberate choice. This stability does not remove the reality of challenges, but it transforms the experience of uncertainty into a manageable and even instructive process. Ultimately, the practice of walking alone, observing one's thoughts, and engaging in disciplined reflection prepares the mind not only for predictable challenges, but also for life's inherent unpredictability. Solitude becomes a training ground for adaptability, foresight, and emotional resilience, a space where the mind learns to act with intelligence and composure rather than being driven by immediate impulses. The next chapter will examine how these principles of solitude, reflection, and mental discipline enhance creativity and insight, revealing how the quiet mind often generates its most profound ideas when unburdened by external noise. Creativity and insight in quiet reflection. There is a paradox in human cognition. Our most profound insights often emerge not in the midst of activity, but in moments of quiet and solitude. When the mind is free from constant distraction and stimulation, it enters a state conducive to creative thought, problem solving, and deep reflection. Walking alone provides the perfect environment for this process, allowing the subconscious to collaborate with conscious attention in ways that are often impossible in noisy, overstimulated conditions. Modern life, saturated with information and expectation, tends to fragment thought. Notifications, social media, and constant multitasking pull attention in countless directions. The mind becomes reactive, jumping from stimulus to stimulus, leaving little room for deep associative thinking. Creativity, however, requires time and space. The ability to connect ideas across domains, to explore possibilities without immediate judgment, and to entertain abstract patterns. Solitude provides exactly that space. Psychologically, the phenomenon can be explained through the activation of the brain's default mode network, DMN. This network becomes active during periods of rest, unstructured thinking, and reflective solitude. It is associated with imagination, self-referential thought, and the synthesis of past experiences with new insights. When engaged, the DMN allows the mind to combine disparate concepts, anticipate possibilities, and generate innovative solutions. Walking alone, free from external interruptions, naturally stimulates this network, providing fertile ground for mental creativity. Historical thinkers provide compelling examples of this process. Montaigne often reflected in quiet isolation, allowing his mind to wander through memories, observations, and philosophical inquiries. His essays reveal the depth of insight that arises when the mind is unhurried, deliberate, and free to explore connections without external demands. Similarly, Seneca practiced reflection in solitude, by using the calm of isolated study to examine human nature and ethical dilemmas with clarity and originality. Creativity in solitude is not limited to abstract thought or philosophical inquiry. It manifests in practical problem-solving, strategic planning, and innovative approaches to daily challenges. The quiet mind allows one to examine patterns that were previously unnoticed, explore alternative perspectives, and identify solutions that are both thoughtful and adaptive. By walking alone, the body's rhythm supports cognitive integration, enhancing both focus and insight. The practice also cultivates a form of mental patience. Many creative insights emerge slowly, appearing only after the mind has been allowed time to process information, synthesize experiences, and reflect on underlying principles. In solitude, one learns to tolerate mental stillness, allowing ideas to surface organically rather than forcing immediate answers. This patience is a crucial complement to the disciplined thinking developed in earlier chapters. Moreover, reflective solitude strengthens intuition. By consistently observing thought patterns and emotional responses, the mind develops a subtle sense of timing, relevance, and probability. Over time, decisions that might once have relied solely on conscious reasoning become informed by an internalized understanding of patterns and potential outcomes. Creativity and insight, then, are not random. They are guided by cultivated mental acuity shaped through deliberate reflection. Walking alone also encourages a heightened awareness of the environment, which often feeds creativity. Observing subtle details, a shadow across a path, the rhythm of footsteps, the movement of leaves in the wind, provides sensory stimuli that the mind can integrate into reflective thought. These seemingly minor observations often serve as catalysts for novel ideas or shifts in perspective. The culmination of this process is a mind that is simultaneously disciplined, resilient, and generative. Emotional stability, independent thought, and long-term planning converge with the capacity for insight, allowing the individual to navigate challenges creatively, respond to uncertainty with flexibility, and generate solutions that are both innovative and practical. Solitude, in this sense, becomes not just a refuge from the world, but a workshop for the mind's most sophisticated functions. During the next chapter, we'll synthesize the lessons of this journey, exploring how walking alone, reflection, and disciplined thought culminate in a holistic practice that strengthens the mind, fosters clarity, and cultivates a life of purpose and intentionality. The holistic practice of the solitary mind. After exploring the many dimensions of solitude, mental observation, emotional discipline, independence from social approval, long-term thinking, resilience, identity transformation, and creativity, we arrive at a unifying principle. Walking alone is more than a physical act. It is a comprehensive exercise for the mind, a deliberate practice that integrates thought, emotion, and intention into a cohesive whole. The modern mind is constantly pulled in multiple directions. Distractions abound, expectations weigh heavily, and the pressure to perform or conform is ever present. In such an environment, clarity and self-mastery are difficult to achieve. Solitude creates a counterbalance, a space where the mind can reset, observe itself, and realign with its own principles rather than external demands. It is in these moments of quiet reflection that the threads of self-discipline, resilience, insight, and foresight weave together into a coherent pattern of inner strength. Philosophical traditions provide timeless insights into this integration. The Stoics, for example, emphasize the unity of thought and action. Marcus Aurelius described daily reflection as a method to ensure that decisions, reactions, and emotions remain aligned with reason and virtue. The solitary mind, freed from distraction, naturally cultivates this alignment, or linking reflection to purposeful action. Psychologically, the practice of walking alone strengthens interconnected neural systems. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for executive function and long-term planning, works in tandem with emotional regulation networks and the default mode network. This integration allows the individual to observe impulses, regulate emotional responses, anticipate future challenges, and generate creative solutions all simultaneously. Over time, the habitual practice of solitude enhances cognitive coherence, emotional stability, and strategic thinking. The practical implications are profound. A person who consistently engages in solitary reflection experiences heightened self-awareness, deeper understanding of motivations, and greater emotional control. They become less susceptible to social pressure, and more capable of long-term planning and more adept at navigating uncertainty. Daily challenges, once overwhelming, are approached with composure and clarity. Creative and strategic insights emerge naturally, informed by disciplined observation and thoughtful evaluation. Importantly, this holistic practice does not demand extreme withdrawal from life. The value of solitude lies not in isolation for its own sake, but in the deliberate cultivation of mental space. Moments of quiet walking, reflection, and observation create intervals where the mind can recalibrate, ensuring that interactions, work, and decision-making are informed by clarity rather than distraction. It is the balance of engagement with the world and retreat into reflection that produces the most profound mental strength. By integrating the lessons from previous chapters, now the practice of walking alone becomes a structured approach to living. Emotional discipline strengthens thought, independent judgment reinforces identity, long-term thinking guides daily action, resilience supports adaptive responses, and creative reflection fuels insight. Together, these capacities form the foundation of a mind capable of both stability and growth, of calm in the face of uncertainty, and of purposeful action in the flow of life. In essence, the solitary mind becomes an instrument, finely tuned through practice, observation, and reflection. It is not merely a passive refuge from the world, but an active laboratory where the mind learns to govern itself, to anticipate challenges, and to generate thoughtful solutions. Walking alone over time transforms the individual into a conscious participant in their own development, and capable of responding to life with both wisdom and composure. This chapter completes the journey through the principles of solitude and reflective practice. Yet the process does not end here. The lessons of observation, emotional control, independence, resilience, identity, foresight, and creativity are not abstract concepts. They are daily exercises, cumulative in effect, and transformative when practiced consistently. The final reflection will tie together these ideas into a calm, thoughtful conclusion, reminding the viewer of the enduring value of walking alone and cultivating the solitary mind. Final reflection. The act of walking alone is deceptively simple. It is often dismissed as a mundane routine, a momentary escape, or a solitary indulgence. Yet, as we have explored, it is a profound practice, an intentional exercise for the mind, a laboratory for thought, and a training ground for emotional and cognitive strength. In these quiet moments, away from distraction, the mind is free to observe itself, confront its impulses, and cultivate clarity. Solitude allows us to confront truths that are otherwise obscured by the busyness of life. It is in these moments that we notice our emotional patterns, uncover habitual reactions, and evaluate our values and priorities. By observing without immediate reaction, we build resilience. By reflecting on our thoughts and choices, we gain independence from the opinions of others. By walking through quiet spaces, we synchronize body and mind, fostering creativity, insight, and strategic thinking. And the journey through solitude reveals that self-mastery is not a distant ideal. It is cultivated daily through consistent attention and a deliberate reflection. Emotional discipline, clarity of thought, and long-term planning are not gifts bestowed by circumstance. They are forged step by step, thought by thought, in the quiet spaces we create for ourselves. The solitary mind becomes a disciplined mind, capable of navigating uncertainty with composure, making deliberate choices, and generating insights that are often inaccessible amidst noise and distraction. Walking alone is also a reminder of the continuity between action and reflection. Each step, each moment of observation reinforces habits of awareness and intentionality. Over time, the mind learns to integrate emotional understanding, independent judgment, resilience, foresight, and creative insight into a coherent whole. This integration allows us not only to endure life's challenges, but to engage with them thoughtfully and purposefully, shaping our path according to reason and principle rather than impulse or social pressure. Ultimately, the practice of solitude is a practice of freedom. Freedom from the tyranny of distraction, from the compulsions of immediate gratification, and from the constant pull of external approval. It is freedom to think, to feel, and to act deliberately. In this freedom, the mind discovers its strength, the will finds direction, and the individual begins to live in alignment with conscious intention rather than reactive habit. As the footsteps carry us forward in quiet reflection, we cultivate not just a stronger mind, but a life shaped by deliberate thought, thoughtful action, and sustained purpose. The art of walking alone is, in essence, the art of cultivating oneself, a practice that transforms the ordinary movement of the body into extraordinary mastery of the mind. And in that mastery, we find not solitude as emptiness, but solitude as fullness, a space where clarity, strength, and insight flourish, shaping a mind capable of navigating life with wisdom, resilience, and intentionality.